Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with me. My name is Tunde. I'm with the Beckman Talent Center at Harvard and also with Department of Journalism, Film and Television at the University of Johannesburg. So I'm talking briefly on mistrust of government in repressive states as a driver of slow adoption of IDs, Nigeria in focus. And I'll start. First, I want to say thank you for all those who have spoken ahead of me. I've learned a lot, and I hope to contribute to the discourse here today. So I'll start with a quote by Kate Breckinridge in his book Biometric States: The Global Politics of Identification and Development in South Africa, page 44. He says, administrative curiosity, a compelling desire for comprehensive and universal information has motivated the development of administrative systems and the relationship between states and society since the middle of the 19th century. So here we have it, a common thread among all states really is that burning urge, to have a comprehensive, knowledge of the governed. But what differentiates states is how they go about designing these systems. So we've spoken a lot today about what are the features of trusted ID systems, but let me just quickly go through some of them again here for your benefit. One, trusted ID systems are built on open technology that are open to audits, that are open to to audits to make sure that they contain nothing in their design, technology, or source code that puts harm to the end user, kind of. Then one other feature is they are vetted via public consultations. That is, the public is involved in the design of such technologies, so that there's kind of public buy-in, right? Then one other feature might be that they have decentralized databases that just to avoid the powers of centralized surveillance and all that. Then one other key feature is that um, IDs are trusted, have it doesn't the government gives people choices, right? The government does not mandate, right, that you must use this particular ID system. So when there's a multiplicity of choices, there's more trust in that context. Let me go to the next slide. But the most important of all this, right? Politics trumps everything, right? The nature of government in power, right, can make nonsense of whatever design is implicit, in particular ID systems. And of course, we've spoken a lot, already, today about what's happened in Afghanistan. You see, the U.S. government left Afghanistan, and the Afghan government to left Afghanistan, placing precious data in the hands of the Taliban. What was used as a tool for payroll management, now became a hit list, so to speak, right? Yeah. So let me now delve down to my particular context today, that is Nigeria, right? This is where I'm going to. Nigeria has an ID system that commenced in the year 2007. It is an 11-digit national identity number that links at least 10 databases. It links your passport information. It plans to link your bank information, health insurance, pensions, driver's license. So it gives the government a comprehensive view of who you are, where you've been to, so that's a lot of power. And that's the plan, right? So as at June this year, that's enrolled 56 million people, right? Now, despite this enormous power of surveillance, right, given to government, right, it's all been smooth, right? There's not been any major public pushback per se until October last year, when things changed, right? You might have followed the NSAS protest in Nigeria. Um, Young people rose up against bad governance, as typified through the police special anti-robbery squad, right? And what young people do elsewhere in the world, in Europe, in America, and they're like cheered for it, right? They were gunned down in Nigeria, right? And many lost their lives, right? Then afterward, the government placed people on surveillance, no-fly lists, bank accounts were closed, right? So that was like, if you see the my link down there, the reference says how NSAS protests changed Nigeria. It was a very dark moment, right? Then just 3 months later, right, the government um, released an updated national ID policy, right? That Nigerians must link their national identity number, right, with their SIM cards, right, and also requesting, IMEI numbers. That is the International Mobile Equipment Identity Numbers, right? So that's even requesting for more powers of surveillance, from citizens. And for the very first time, right, people said no, that, that's enough, right? You can't have my IMEI. I will not link my SIM to my name, right? For the very first time in about in about say 16 years, kind of, or the project, right? It hit a brick wall of public mistrust, right? The mistrust was so strong that the deadlines, for linking in and SIM had to be moved 7 times, because people just refused. There were there were serious pockets of resistance, to this move by government, right? So, and this threatened the future of the ID project, right? So how do we, in this kind of context, right? How do we build back trust? Now, I put out here a theory of change, right? We have two options. We can either influence deeper democratic reforms, right? Or we might choose to instead influence project reforms, right? Now, the former is long term, right? We can't predict what the outcomes will look like, right? While the latter looks more manageable, right? It is more circumscribed. You can, it looks more achievable. Now, the lever here is the World Bank Group. Why? Because the World Bank supports at least 60 ID projects, in the global south. Now, take note of that geography. The World Bank supports, national ID projects in the global south, right? Now, this same concept of a national ID, right, a national biometric system, centralized control, right, has been resisted in the UK, right? The UK has no national, centralized biometric system, right? It's been shut down in the US and elsewhere, right? But somehow, some planners think that it's good for Africa. Now, in this context, the UK, US, we have better standards for human rights. We have more mature democracies. So, and in those contexts where we have, better democracies, better rights, better stands for human rights. This idea of a central control, right, was deemed a bad idea, right? You know, if it was deemed a bad idea for such, context, then it can be a good idea for Africa, right? Where we have poor human rights standards, where we still have fledgling um, democracies, because there is more room for abuse. So what is bad for the US and UK can't be good for Africa. That's my point, right? So following up on my idea, right? What if the World Bank, instead of funding this large, large, central biometric, IDs, in the global south? Why not invest in existing, identity systems, in these countries? For instance, in Nigeria, the voters registration contains 84 million, you know, um, people already. That is more than 30 million above the number for the current national, identity project. That's huge. So what if the World Bank decides to upgrade as in, to fund upgrading, the voters register, driver's licenses, population registers, and so forth, so that it achieves the same aim of giving people some sort of, identity to participate, right, in national life. At the same time, not giving the government that kind of powers of central control, which is dangerous in the context of, emerging democracies and poor human rights standards, which is usually typical of the global south. Now, you, you might say, well, you might say, well, that's wrong. The aim of these projects, of these national projects, is to create foundational databases. But when you look at the data contained, in these so-called functional IDs, right, they are just as rich, right? They are just as rich as the so-called foundational IDs, because they ask. If you go right now to Nigeria's voters registration, it asks detailed information about who you are, your address. It's just as almost close to what we might call a foundational ID per se, and it also contains biometrics, right? So I want to propose, or just put forward that as a researcher and someone that lives in the global south, someone that has worked here and also works in civil society, right? What is bad for the US and UK can't be good for us, because our context, these systems are more prone to abuse, right? Now, achieving this kind of disparate, the disparate ID systems, right, can be harder, right? But they will build trust and ensure a more safer system, right? Yeah. Thank you for your audience.
That's really good. Yeah, thank you very much. And I have to agree. We've had a tension in the project in the Turing Institute, where we're funded by the Gates Foundation to look at these national digital ID systems, and we work with a number of countries, and we do observe that there's a tendency for the ID systems to have centralized databases, and then push people into those centralized databases in developing countries, where when you contrast this with, I think you mentioned Canada and the previous talk about zero trust, we heard the Canadians, at least one province there has said their government will use decentralized system. Estonia have talked about it. So it's clear that places that have wide technological infrastructures already deployed are kind of jumping straight into looking at decentralized. And I think also we heard previously, this is not a there is available technology for this decentralized approaches, but your proposal is kind of interesting, which is to use the money for the centralized ID instead of doing centralized digital systems, just deal with the legacy paper systems. I think that's and obviously that makes a lot of sense, because it also deals with several talks earlier, which were talking about inclusivity. And if you have to think about all the people that use paper for proving various properties, the attributes of themselves, or when they were born, where they were born, who their parents are, whatever, then if you have to onboard them into just a database without creating a new digital ID system, you have to consider all the inclusivity arguments. So that would force governments to think carefully about the design of the system for all the reasons it should be used, which I think is a really great idea, actually. I think that's kind of interesting. And it's going to be an interesting fight, because obviously the organizations like the World Bank have their own agendas.
Yes. Can I just respond, please?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So you mentioned that why not invest that funding, right, to digitize paper IDs, right? Now, they are not just in paper. A lot of them are already right digitized already. You're right. So if you go to the agency that does Nigeria's ID, they ask you to bring any of about 16 documents. Your passport, your voters registration, your driver's license. So any of those things, right, can instead serve as the ID. Why do we need to now coalesce all of them, right, into a central database? So, they are not just in paper. Some already, in digital format, right? So it's quite a straightforward, process for a lot of them already, right? So I'm just worried that I saw a tweet one day, right, that because the World Bank is funding these things, they are right and just not necessarily right, yeah, because in Africa here, right, we are still building our institutions, they're not as strong as in the West, right? And we need systems that can thwart abuse. Yeah, 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 yeah. We need systems that can thwart abuse and can be used to to oppress people, as is usually the case, in Africa a lot of times. Yeah.
So yeah, I know, I completely agree. I think your point is that you have all these different pieces of credential that some
Yes.
can be used for some things, some can be used for other already, and that's actually
Yes.
what we have in the UK, where we don't have a
Mm,
single ID, we don't have ID
exactly.
cards.
Yeah.
You have all these different identifiers, which, if you wanted to federate them in a decentralized way, that would be okay. But you don't need to combine all the data in one centralized database, because
Exactly.
that
Yes.
then gives this, what you referred to at the beginning, the historical lesson was very interesting, that
Yeah.
from a long time ago, the governments
Yeah.
were curious about how
Mm,
people were doing things. They start to monitor it, and then the mission drifts into being a surveillance state, as a modern phrase, I think. And that's very problematic. And as you say, with some governments, that can then lead to a misuse of power, which it doesn't have to just be in the global south. We have plenty of governments in the north who've
yeah.
misused their power. I
Yeah.
think the best strong example historically in Europe was that the Germans were the really strongest about privacy and proposing GDPR. And one of the reasons was that when East Germany was separate, it had a huge surveillance state. And when they reunified Germany, East and West, that put a lot of pressure to not have the government have lots of data on people, on citizens.
Yeah.
And I think that was a lesson that, you may have an okay government now, but you don't know what they will be like 10 years from
Exactly.
now. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.